Welcome to Freestyle Theology. I'm Dr. Bradley Melle, historian of global Christianity and culture, and I'm here with my friend, the Reverend Joash Thomas, for our second time together, which is really awesome.
That's right.
And we are finally in person. You might, if you're just listening to this, you can't see, but we are sitting here in chairs, physical chairs,
Real chairs.
in each other's presence. This is a subversive move. So it's good to have you here. Good to see you again. It's been a while.
Yeah, I mean, we had to schedule this thing 2 or 3 months out in advance just to be in the same room, mostly because of my erratic life and travel schedule. But I'm glad we're here.
You have been all over for the last 2 months.
That's right.
Where are some of the places you've hit?
So between the last time we saw each other in person and now, which was really only 2 months ago, I've been to Bolivia, I've been to India, 3 different cities there. I've been to the United Arab Emirates, been to Vancouver, Kelowna, Winnipeg, Dallas, Texas as of last week, and I'm headed to Calgary next week. So that's life.
So you've been to the UAE and Winnipeg.
And
those
Winnipeg.
are some pretty
Very different places.
Yeah, very. Oh, that's cool, man. And you've been talking justice?
Yeah, in most of these places. So UAE was for vacation. Have to say that, so I'm allowed back into the country, I guess. But no. Part of it was vacation, but most of it was work, and some of it included talks and speaking and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's great. I think for me, more than as I've kind of decolonized my theology, for me, what's important isn't being a teacher, going into these spaces and being seen as a teacher. What I'm really curious about is being a learner, and going to these places and experiencing the culture and learning from them. And yeah, even if I have a teaching role and moment, I'm still trying to humble myself and learn from their perspectives and allow myself to be taught by the people there, whether that's Winnipeg or the UAE.
Well, I mean, that definitely, you use that word decolonized. And that way of just approaching other people and other places, I see why you use that word.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds so obvious and so simple.
Yeah.
To go somewhere new and come with a humble posture, not as like the teacher,
Right.
but as a learner, as a participant. And that,
as the Padawan,
right,
as some folks might say.
Yeah, some nerdy folks would say. But that gets right at what we're wanting to talk about today.
Yeah.
Which is, we want to talk about colonialism and Christianity.
Yeah.
Which is a massive topic.
Yeah.
Something that I have studied, something that you have studied, something that we have both lived.
Yeah.
From very different ways of living with that legacy. And so kind of what I want to do here today is just let ourselves kind of explore, when it comes to colonialism and Christianity, like, where does your mind go? How does your body react? What do we need to think more about? So yeah, when I say let's talk about Christianity and colonialism.
Yeah.
Where does your kind of mind first go?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's funny how we talked about Christian supremacy last time, and we're talking about Christian colonization this time, right? And it's just, that's the reality of history. It makes us uncomfortable, but it sets us free at the same time. All of us have inherited our faith from somewhere, right? Those of us who identify as Christians specifically, our faith doesn't exist in a vacuum. We've inherited it. And I think what I've really appreciated in studying the history of these things is better understanding my faith, how it's been shaped historically by these things. And colonization is just one of those things that has shaped modern day history today. Like, there's no escaping it. Whether you realize it or not, you're either a beneficiary of colonization, or you're someone who's a survivor of colonization, or in the case of many of us, or most of us, it's likely both. We're beneficiaries and survivors, right? So I became a beneficiary of colonization the day I moved to the US. and then to Canada, living on stolen land, right? But I'm also a survivor of colonization because I grew up in India. But to go back to your original question, what do I think of? I just can't help but think of my ancestors and my family history, because colonization isn't an academic theory for me. It's definitely an academic theory, but it's not just an academic theory for me. It's lived experience. Um, I this is a bit of a side trail, so just track with my ADHD brain a little bit here. But uh, a few months ago, I was getting my annual physical at the doctor's, and the doctor was kind of like, "Have you been drinking more alcohol? Because your liver is developing a lot of fat around it, like fatty liver." And so I went down this rabbit trail of looking into fatty liver. I was like, this thing was almost non-existent in my last checkup. Where did this come from? And I realized that there's history for this that's tied to colonization, where
Really?
yeah, where essentially so many of us who come from communities that were colonized find ourselves developing fatty liver in our 30s, mysteriously. And there's genetic reasons for it, because our ancestors were starved because of colonialism. So our bodies are genetically not like our bodies today, aren't accustomed to holding as much food as compared to our ancestors, and because they were starved, and so because I'm a well-fed 21st century North American, I am very vulnerable to developing fatty liver. So that's something I have to watch out for, regardless of what I'm eating or drinking. So it's lived experience for us in ways that we don't even realize. That's the first thought that comes to mind.
Yeah, that's
My fatty liver. That's what comes to mind from colonization.
your fatty liver. No, that's I mean, that gets us into, moving away from just an intellectualized history,
Yeah.
or even just like a social structures based history, but the body's history.
Yes.
Like the genetic code has a history. Again, it sounds like you're right. Your ancestors, their bodies started to shift in order
Yeah.
to hold on to, fat and energy,
Yeah.
and that gets passed on. And I mean, that touches on so many of the things that we both talk about, which is
Mm.
from different perspectives, the trauma of the past that gets passed on, right?
Mm.
Um, and colonization is a major source of sort of the environment of trauma for people.
Wow.
And yes, for non-Western people, that trauma experienced as more so as violence, right?
Mm.
Various forms of violence, whether that's dispossession,
Mm.
whether that's imprisonment or actual violence. And then for the colonizer and their their descendants, of which I would be one, um, it's still an environment of trauma, because
Mm.
doing things to people and witnessing that and experiencing that also like damages the person.
Totally.
And that reminds me of that book, My Grandmother's Hands, if you've read that.
I haven't. No.
No?
Tell us about
My
that.
Grandmother's Hands by Reesma Menaken, I think is his name. But My Grandmother's Hand is a book about racialized intergenerational trauma,
Wow.
and he explores it in three different groups,
Mm.
like Black Americans, white Americans, and
Mm.
police Americans. So black bodies, white bodies, and police bodies.
Mm.
And he shows how, he's a trauma therapist. He actually works with the Minneapolis Police Department, training them, which is really something given
No kidding.
what
George
happened with
Floyd.
George Floyd.
Right.
Yeah. I've always wondered what that experience was like for him, having worked with the Minneapolis Police Department.
Wow.
But that book really shows how something that you talk about a lot, which is, you talk about how colonization was bad for the colonized and the colonizer. And
Yes.
that book will you'll get right into like how that affects the bodies of different
Mm.
peoples, how
Mm.
they carry this trauma in different ways,
Mm.
which if it goes unacknowledged, unprocessed,
Right.
unengaged with, it will erupt
Wow.
again and again and again, and then perpetuate itself, right?
Wow.
So I
Yeah.
think colonization and the body, I'm glad you went there first,
Mm.
because it's I think that's arguably one of the most important things
Yeah.
to explore and
Wow.
open up.
Wow. Let me ask you this. How did you tie the two together? Because, I mean, you're an academic who has studied, you have your PhD in colonialism and how it shaped Christianity in North America, indigenous communities. But how did the body come into this? Because when we're academics, it's so easy for us to be disembodied in how we look at things, even history. So, yeah, just out of curiosity, how did that bodily theory kind of get enmeshed with your research focus?
The honest truth, though, is that in my actual dissertation research, what I studied was, just in case anyone doesn't know, what I studied was evangelicalism and
Wow.
Indigenous communities.
Mm,
So I wanted to explore the Indigenous history of Christianity in the time sort of after residential schools, because I wondered what happened there. And I knew there was some evangelical growth, and I wanted to understand how could that possibly have happened. So that asked me, eventually I had to look back at the colonial legacy
wow.
in order to understand what, if any, like, what's the word, resonances evangelicalism,
Mm,
even fundamentalist evangelicalism, had with
mm,
indigenous populations who had been colonized. I wanted to explore, like, there must be some resonances or else this movement wouldn't exist, and
wow.
it does. So that history was more structural and cultural. I didn't really incorporate much of the body into that at that
Mm,
time.
mm,
Really, it wasn't until my own experience, my own bodily experience with trauma, which would
wow.
have been from in when I was in the middle of my doctoral program, developed like a very serious case of ulcerative colitis,
Mm,
where my body is like attacking itself and was just kind of destroying itself. It's like an
wow.
autoimmune disease.
Wow.
And so that was because I have grown up very privileged
Mm,
up until that point in many, many ways,
mm,
kind of in every way. That was my first experience with kind of everything breaking down.
wow.
And then, you go through the whole thing trying to find treatments. Eventually, you find something that works. I was excited. I'm like, it's all going to go back to normal. But the mental toll and like sort of the body keeping the score
Mm,
of losing faith in your body's ability to like heal itself and protect you, the mental effects were so intense that I developed some really potent agoraphobia and panic disorder.
goodness.
And so it wasn't until then, it's just so interesting to me how I was able to keep that so separate from what I was actually
Mm,
looking at. Because when you study history, all you're doing is studying human beings, communities of human beings.
right.
And I was, very deeply Western, and you can kind of forget that people are bodies. They're
Mm,
not ideas. They're not intellects. They're
they're
bodies.
not beliefs. They're not
Yeah,
just what they believe.
exactly. And so eventually a light went on when I was like, kind of suffering with this crippling panic disorder,
Mm,
that the only way forward for me was because I kind of tried a bunch of different things, like praying it away wasn't working. In fact, a lot of my praying was, now I realize, just looped anxiety.
wow.
I would wake up in the morning and feel kind of like extremely anxious just about anything.
Mm,
And I would do what I had kind of learned to do as a teenager, which was my prayer life was mostly just me begging God for forgiveness,
mm,
even though I wouldn't have done there was nothing I was asking for forgiveness for. My
mm.
prayer life was just begging for forgiveness because that's what I knew you did with feelings of anxiety.
Wow.
Because so it's like the very like bodily sensation I was experiencing was anxiety, and I
Yeah.
had learned that means something's wrong. You need to ask for forgiveness.
Let me ask you this. Was there an element of I need to ask for forgiveness because I'm suffering and maybe the two are correlated? I must have done something to kind of cause this suffering. Was that an element of this faith journey at that point at all?
It's yeah, it's complicated because
Yeah.
I had a fairly well developed like intellectual understanding of how that's not
Sure.
the case.
Yeah.
I was like, my suffering is just a part of what would I have said at that time? Just like a result of the fallen world,
Right.
but kind of in a little bit of a Christian nihilistic way, where it's just like, that's just the way things are until God magically makes it all better, which isn't really how I would approach it now.
Yeah.
But at a bodily level, yes, because I can remember I would like, if bad things would happen, if my kids would get sick, it's like, even though in my neocortex, in my cognitive brain, I was thinking, this has nothing to do with anything I've done. This is just life. At some bodily level, I would still be like begging for forgiveness. I must have done something wrong. And so it's
Wow.
twisted, right? Like
So
it's twisted. And it's one of these unexpected effects of sort of a kind of a, what's the word? An absolutizing of original sin,
Yes.
where it's like what you're taught at a theoretical level
Yeah.
is that every person is truly deserving of God's rejection
Yeah.
and punishment. And anything that happens that's good is because God is gracious. And I'm just like,
Yeah.
I don't think Augustine's his intention was for that to become so absolutized as it did. But in theory, me feeling anxious and begging for forgiveness was actually the right thing to do.
Wow.
I don't think that now. I don't believe that now. I don't even believe that bodily now.
Yeah.
But it's just one of these after effects of a theology that's like putting too much weight on a certain doctrine and trying to explain the whole world through it.
Yeah. Yeah. You were almost conditioned into doing that. It was your muscular response.
Yeah, exactly.
Your spiritual muscular response to a situation of suffering was to ask for forgiveness.
Spiritual muscle memory.
Yes.
To experience any
muscle memory.
Yeah.
I know why I said muscular. That's good.
to interpret any kind of negative bodily sensation or emotion as conviction or,
Right. No, this is good. I mean, let's keep going down that trail a little bit, because you and I have had conversations about original sin recently, and I'd love to bring folks into that. So I've been reading Richard Rohr's new book, The Tears of Prophets. It's funny how I discovered this book. I was looking on the Amazon Canada bestsellers for the categories that my book was in, and my book was number one, humble brag, number one for the first week of pre-orders in 4 different categories, except for one category, Christian ethics, where it was number 2. And the number 1 book in that category was Richard Rohr's new book, which is how I was like, well, first off, deservedly so. And secondly, I need to buy that book and keep it number 1 because it's Richard Rohr, and I'm a huge fan of his Franciscan theology. But Richard Rohr, in his book, The Tears of Saints, talks about original sin. And the way he frames it is so beautiful. He says, what has often, including in the Bible, been misdiagnosed maybe as original sin is probably just generational trauma. And that blew my mind. And it made me think of you and your work. So how do you see that original sin tying into colonialism? So now we're getting the historian and the theologian here to mesh these 2 worlds together. But I'd love your thoughts and your take.
Yeah, I was happy when you shared that quote, because I find that's really speaking to a direction I'm moving in.
Wow.
Because I've, for some of you probably know, I do talk about intergenerational trauma in the church to help explain some of Western Christianity's dysfunctions.
Right.
But I'm realizing that it goes much further than that. Because here's what I'll say. You try to figure out why there are things like empire.
Yeah.
Why is there something like an empire that is so hell-bent on dominating, taking away freedoms or bestowing freedom to the people that it wants to,
right,
exploiting people? Like a lot of these actions that empires take, we gloss them over with these narratives of glory, majesty. And then we have this architecture, and you don't have to throw all that out. They're human beings make cool things. When we have resources, we make cool things.
Sure.
But we also,
especially when you steal resources, you can make
exactly.
You can make better things.
You make better and better things the more resources you get. Okay, this is sounding like colonialism. There's too many directions to go. But what I just had this simple thought, which is like, what is the sort of bodily origin of empire?
Wow.
We talk about it ideologically, but the human experience, our thoughts, our ideas about things, at least this is what I've come to believe. And there's certain schools of thought that would agree, like the somatic approach to therapy, that our body experiences, like our sensations experience things first. It's so rapid that we connect them instantaneously, but the thinking part of our brain is the youngest. It's the most recently evolved. It's the most, and it has given humans this incredible advantage. We can strategize, plan ahead. And it's also come with a lot of curses, like we can see our own death, right? So it's like our thinking brain has unlocked all kinds of new anxieties and traumas, even as it's also given us all these gifts, right?
Wow.
But I think at its core, the experience of scarcity, the experience of loss,
Yes.
of being oppressed yourself,
Yes.
of being like maimed, of having your resources taken away, like all of that impacts the human person and community at the most fundamental level. And it unlocks some of our greatest cruelties.
Wow.
When we're afraid,
Wow.
when we won't, like we're afraid of our next meal. In a way, it comes out of, we're thinking of our children, and we're willing to do some pretty horrible things.
Absolutely.
And that gets passed on as trauma. And what I'm coming to really believe is that empires begin as like scared people who are willing to do whatever it takes to never run out of resources again, and to never lose and suffer in the same way again. And once we start a project like that, which you can feel empathy for, it's weird to be speaking so empathetically about empire, but I think it starts with the experience of trauma, and then that gets passed on as cultural norms, and then it gets passed on as like some people are superior to others. Like that's how the Romans and Greeks thought of themselves, right? Everyone else was inferior. Some people were even subhuman. Some, women were seen as a lesser species of human. All kinds of new inequalities come, new toxic ideas that is our thinking minds interpreting our experience. And so you're like, we've started to dominate. We are better. We have defeated the weak. Now we get all their resources. They are our slaves. But I think if you go drill down to its core, it starts with an experience of pain that's like that, never again.
Right.
I think that's what Israel, the state of Israel, is doing.
1000%.
Never again. That was like one of the mottos. Fair enough. Never again to the Holocaust. But the state of Israel right now shows exactly this process of extreme trauma turning into a protective form of oppression of Palestinians.
Totally. The oppressed can become the oppressors. And this is one of the greatest lessons that history can teach us, is that there are never clear categories of the oppressed and the oppressor, especially in terms of people groups, because they can switch sides. And this is where I found Catholic social teaching to be helpful in understanding God's preferential option for the poor and the oppressed, which basically says that God stands on the side of people who are oppressed. And if the oppressed and oppressors ever switch sides, then God also switches sides to stand with the newly oppressed group of people, right? And but just going back a little bit to what you said about trauma and how that shapes people into becoming the oppressors, into going from being the oppressed to the oppressors, I think of the Portuguese Catholic Jesuits in India in the 1600s, right? You have all these stories of these Jesuits, which is fascinating because I've got dear Jesuit friends here in Ontario, and I have these discussions with them too, and they lament and grieve with me. But there's this phase where Portuguese Catholic Jesuits would go into Hindu temples and just do mission in very insensitive ways, by yelling obscenities at Hindu deities, by cursing out, by causing a ruckus, by just being jerks, honestly. And one of them, who was actually Jesuit ambassador to the court of the Mughal Emperor of India, Emperor Akbar, found his death that way, and he wanted that martyrdom. He wanted to be killed in a Hindu temple, and he prayed Saint Stephen's prayer as he was being stoned to death. But it's coming from a place of trauma, because I've been reading secular Hindu Indian historians who write about this phase of history, and they make connections to what was happening to the Catholic Church in Europe at the same time, post-Reformation, where the Catholic Church was being accused of not being evangelistic enough, of not caring about the salvation of souls enough, of being too paganistic, And so they react to these ways by then going overseas, hand in hand with colonial empires, and then oppressing others, so that they're never classified into being that again, right? And so again, that's just one tangible historical example of the oppressed becoming the oppressors after being shaped by trauma.
And I mean, what it's making me think of is the oppressed turning into the oppressor is a pattern, but it's not a inevitable process. Because if there's one thing I can say, and there's a lot of things you can say about the indigenous peoples of North America, it is that throughout the last 500 years, over and over and over again, collectively, indigenous people, communities have been emotionally mature, even with the some of the greatest suffering imaginable, like having everything taken away. Not just your land, I mean, that's the big one, but even just the respect for your ways. Good, and there are good ways, very good ways of living in the world. Very sustainable, very harmonious. Like, this is not me romanticizing indigenous communities, because you will find this in the sources.
Because you studied this and you have a PhD in this. But go on.
You'll find this in the sources of their biggest enemies, who are still saying, like, there is a lot of harmony here. And so I just have noticed that there is an element of, like, you have this traumatic history. What are you going to do with it? And well, I'm not trying to paint everyone with a broad brush. I'm just saying, historically, in Canada and the United States, indigenous peoples were welcoming and mature when newcomers, European colonizers arrived. And have consistently come to the table for, like, treaty conversations. And have given the settler populations more chances than they should ever have been allowed, and continue to do this. And then, one of the major shifts of the 20th century in indigenous history was, at least in Canada, a lot of people, we learn a little bit about colonization, and we're starting to learn about residential schools, but we don't really know the history of kind of what happens after the 60s. And you have two major movements that sort of are shaping indigenous life as a whole. And one is, like, the political sovereignty movement, like reclaiming self-respect and sovereign control over territories, however small they might be. And the second is called the Aboriginal healing movement. There has been a concerted effort, and this is one of the main things I've studied in indigenous communities in North America, Canada, and the US, to pursue healing as, like, the way forward, the future. And I just find that to be so inspiring. And then you're talking about the sort of background to the Jesuits and the Portuguese Jesuits. And in that case, it's like responding to trauma in a really immature way, like the way, like, a bully does. A bully is bullied at home and then bullies, and that's a child. Like, we shouldn't expect a child to be acting. They are immature, but adults, it's like, this touches on so much, because, in the therapeutic world, of which there's a lot of different modalities, a lot of different ways of pursuing healing, some better than others. It's more common now to kind of be opening up our childhoods or our backgrounds and kind of placing blame there. But a lot of people get stuck there because it feels it feels kind of good and progressive, not progressive politically, but like you are making progress
Sure.
to be like, I've located the source of my dysfunctions. It's their fault.
Wow.
But it's kind of like, once, like, you are not responsible for what happened to you. Things happened to you. But once you are an adult, it is your responsibility to be like, where am I going to move with this?
Wow.
And so we've all inherited trauma, some of us more than others.
Yeah.
It lies behind all kinds of things. So I think Richard Rohr's point about maybe original sin, what Augustine was seeing, because he wasn't just reading the Bible and being like, I've distilled the truth. He was experiencing a world. He was actually experiencing the destruction of Rome, the Roman world, in his lifetime. He watched his city burn by the Vandals, right? And his theology is impacted by the trauma he's living in. And so original sin, you can see how that would make sense. But if we start to look at it through the lens of intergenerational trauma, I think it actually makes more sense of what we're doing. And it doesn't like take any teeth out of the problems in the world. It just gives us a new way to be like, just a simple question, but like, what does a person do? What can people or communities do to process and metabolize this traumatic past and move into a new future?
Right. Just going back to connecting this to something we talked about earlier, which is Zionism. I find it fascinating that I think the numbers are overwhelming. It's like over 70% of the Jewish community in the US does not support Zionism, does not support the state of Israel and being an oppressor to its Palestinian neighbors. 70% of Jewish folks in America. Contrast that with over 80% of white evangelicals in the US are Zionists, actually support the bombing of children in Gaza, right? I mean, again, talking about trauma responses, right? It seems like the Jewish community, in the US is quite mature about the trauma that they've endured. But then you've got others, white evangelical folks in America, who feel this persecution complex because of trauma, likely feeling isolated and left out and threatened, and feel like their power and their dominion is being threatened. Their resources could be taken away. Just fears like that coming from a place of trauma, and that's shaping them into their Zionism, into bombing children in Gaza, into starving children in Gaza to death, right? It's fascinating what trauma does if we look at the world and sin through that lens.
Yeah, I think it really does. It doesn't actually, interestingly, it doesn't actually change the notion that like sin is kind of woven through creation.
Yeah.
It just shifts it's like it changes the narrative a little bit, where it's like sin doesn't just mean the bad things you do. Sin is all the hurt, all the damage, all the tears, all the pain that is woven through the world.
Wow.
And I think in a way, intergenerational trauma it lines up so well with this vision that like something is wrong and some wrongness is woven into the world.
Yeah. So I love that we've been talking about trauma and the oppressed, the oppressor, colonialism, all light topics so far.
Yeah.
Let's talk about another interesting trend happening in the North American church right now, which is, and I say this, it's funny, like I've had my journey into sacramentalism from evangelicalism, because I've thought that so much of Western evangelicalism is too patriarchal, too oppressive, too colonialistic, and that's kind of driven me into a more sacramental direction. But at the same time, I'm learning that there are a lot of people, men in particular, who are leaving the evangelical church and going into a more sacramental tradition, specifically the Orthodox church, for the complete opposite reason, which is they think that the evangelical church is not colonialistic enough, not patriarchal enough, not strong or masculine enough. And you've got this exodus of those folks joining the Orthodox Church, which is actually causing a lot of divisiveness in the Orthodox Church and to our Orthodox Christian neighbors, because now all of a sudden they're being inundated with this divisive rhetoric and people coming in with their own agendas, wanting to shape an ancient tradition, an Eastern tradition that's been minding its own business for 2,000 years, right? How do you think that ties into everything we've talked about so far?
Yeah, this is actually something that I've thought about and noticed, because from what I've studied of the Western Church, which is quite a bit, yes, I studied colonial Christianity, but in order to study a historical era, you need to study its roots, and that's
Yeah.
why I keep ending up back in the medieval era.
Mm.
I'm not a medieval historian, but the medieval church, the Western medieval church, is the background to the modern church.
Wow.
So it's like it's family history. And ever since the Reformation, this was the point of my last podcast episode, was talking about fragmentation. And I was saying how fragmentation, the experience of fragmentation, is the deep context of the Western world for the last 500 years. I argued that that's not all bad, because fragmentation, breaking apart the old medieval certainty, was inevitable and necessary, because people need to grow up and mature.
Wow.
And ever since the Reformation happened, Christians in the West have been searching for the one true church. What they're trying to get back to is the old certainty that people had, Western Christians had in the Middle Ages.
Wow.
When there was one church, there was no question about whose authority was the right authority. There was no question about who got to interpret the Bible. It was the Catholic Church. There was a security and a safety in that kind of solid unity.
Right.
Again, I think that was not sustainable in the long term, and it really changed when the colonial period was initiated, because now you realized this institution, this religion that said it kind of had all the answers, it didn't even know that there was another half of the world.
Yeah.
And so people's minds are expanding like very, very rapidly. It's disorienting, right? Like, what else did they not know? But ever since the Reformation, you have all these different groups claiming they're the true church. They're the true church. We understand what the Bible really means, et cetera, et cetera. And that kind of marks Protestantism at its heart, right? It's like an attempt to rediscover and re-enliven the true church.
Wow.
And so what I've noticed is it's not super surprising to me that Protestants, very committed to that project of finding and identifying with the one true church, are now bypassing the Catholic Church, because we have all this historical baggage with the Catholic Church, right? It's part of Protestantism, just at some fundamental level, is kind of an anti-Catholicism. And they see the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and Protestants are, quote, converting to Orthodoxy.
Wow.
And I know that this is not everyone's experience. Some people just find themselves drawn into Orthodoxy because that's where the Spirit is leading them. Right. That's very different than a lot of what you're talking about, which is
totally.
I see this in my comments section a lot, because I bring up the Eastern traditions of Christianity, not because I'm trying to say they're the right ones and the West is wrong, but because I need Western Christians to understand that the let's say Augustinian ways of doing theology have never been the way everyone does theology. Right. So I bring it up to decenter the West.
Wow.
But I get a lot of people saying like, well, you need to just convert to Orthodoxy because that's the true church. And I'm like, oh, it's Protestants doing Orthodox cosplay for a lot of people. They're growing the beard, they're going to the divine liturgy, but they're still Protestants. Right. And they're looking at other Christians and saying, you're the heretics, you're outside the true church. And I'm like, that's what we know.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's such a colonial way of looking at the world too. And, I just graduated from the top Western evangelical seminary in the world that has a tagline of teach truth, love well, right? And that teaching truth part can be beautiful if you see truth as Jesus, but it can also be weaponized at the same time when you're approaching it from a Western colonized lens and saying, oh, teach truth, and you have all these undertones, implications that Truth isn't the LGBTQ agenda, the Marxist agenda, the woke agenda, the global South agenda, or whatever the flavor du jour is that day. Um, yeah, so it's fascinating that you have such an emphasis on truth, gospel, and these are words that tend to get weaponized so much. They're beautiful words, but they're weaponized often in Western evangelical context and brandished and used as a sword to smack people in the head with, if they step out of line. When in reality, it assumes a posture of pride and arrogance, and we know what the truth is. We're gatekeepers of the truth. These are all pagans and heathens. We need to save them. We don't, like we already have the truth. We're okay. We don't need further transformation. They need to be saved with our truth and our version of the truth. And you see these two things clashing. You see the colonizers' gospel and the gospel of St. Thomas Indian Christians, a pre-colonial, pre-Columbus Christian tradition that's been worshiping Jesus longer than many parts of the West were worshiping Jesus, right? And then you have the Catholic Church come to India, run into St. Thomas Indian Christians, my ancestors, and tell us St. Peter is here and St. Thomas is here. And St. Peter is superior to St. Thomas for our listeners who can't watch us gesticulating with our hands right now. But and there's this whole posture of superiority that comes in with colonialism that's influenced the Western church even today in the way these Protestant Christians who are leaving the Protestant church are looking at other traditions and saying, well, if the truth isn't here and our version of the truth isn't here, then it has to be somewhere else, but it has to be in one place. We're going to go look for that one place. When in reality, Jesus is everywhere. If you're looking at truth as Jesus, Jesus is everywhere if we have the eyes to see him everywhere, right? You can't put God in a box. You can't put the Spirit and the Spirit's work of transformation in a box. But that's what the colonizers did. And that's what people shaped by the colonizers' gospel still do today in the church.
I think that gets to the very core nucleus of colonialism. Now, it has a few, the nucleus of colonialism has a few key components. One just being the desire for more land, like the acquisition of land. But colonialism did and does have a religious component from day one. This is not, I, for a long time, tried to get around Christianity's role in colonialism, trying to be like, colonialism wasn't generated by Christianity. Christianity just got tagged along and was complicit. And I'm like, that's not true. And the way you just said it really clarified it. The truth, if the truth is not here, it must be over here because it must be in one place. Correct. That says it all. That's what the Western church, that's how it developed. That truth was the exclusive possession of one institution.
Yeah.
And the Reformation did not change that. That's the strange thing. You had the one institution break apart into many, many, many pieces, right, each one claiming that this institution possessed the truth. And this is the part of colonialism. There's so much we can say about it, but that drives me crazy. This is the immature part of it. Yeah. You discover that there is another half of the earth. Tens of millions of other people who have no connection to you, who have lived doing their thing for 10,000 years or more. And your response to that is, well, we need to kind of make them like us. Right. Like the absolute arrogance of that. And Christianity, as it developed in Western Europe, is right on board with that. With, yes, you have a select few. There's always exceptions to every single historical pattern, right? There are people who are defending Indigenous rights early on. There are people who are trying to learn Indigenous languages and ways with some respect, like some of the Jesuits did. Yeah. But you have, what's the larger pattern? That's what's like important historically, right? Yes, there's exceptions. What's the larger pattern? The larger pattern is, wow, there's another whole part of the earth that we need to crusade in, that we need to bring under the one church. Like, I have a lot of respect for, the ancient church, ancient Christianity. I do not see ancient Christianity as more authoritative.
Yeah.
I just don't.
Yeah.
Like,
that would go against everything we just talked about right now.
Exactly. And so, like, again, with the Orthodox sort of Protestant conversion to Orthodoxy thing, there's this new kind of thing that these Protestant Orthodox people do, which is they'll start treating the church fathers almost as if they're this new infallible source of like pure theology. The church fathers have a lot of great stuff, especially if you understand them in their time and place, in their linguistic, cultural, historical context. Then what they have to say comes to life. And you can say, wow, there's some of this I really don't understand, and other stuff really resonates. That's great. But treating the church fathers as if they are the pure truth is the classic Western error of absolutizing knowledge and being like, here it is in this one place. And everything since then is a degradation. No, that's not how the Spirit works. And so how this connects is everything that happens in the history of Christianity before the year 1492 is pre-Columbian Christianity. This is pre-Western Hemisphere. So to claim that like the church had the whole truth and it didn't even know there was another half of the earth, we have to, what that means theologically is, where are the new church fathers and mothers? Like, there are countless indigenous cultures and societies. The reason we use the word indigenous is because there's the diversity is so great that it would take us all day to explore, Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Sioux, Lakota, and that's just the slice of them, right? The church fathers, who are usually in a Greek or Latin context or Syriac or a few Indian, their theology came out of their particular cultural milieus, right? Where is that when it comes to encountering totally new peoples? Mayan theology, Aztec, and you can quickly be like, well, those places were, doing human sacrifice. You're stereotyping an entire people with a whole history. You want to do that with Western Europe? Easy. Oh, they're just people who use the Iron Maiden and like, imprisoned heretics and burned women.
This also makes me think of salvation, or soteriology, as is known in theology.
Big graduate using the fancy terms.
Got to drop those words now. I have permission to drop those words now. But it has me thinking and wondering often, what did my St. Thomas Christian ancestors believe in India before the colonizers show up, right? And that's something I'm curious to maybe even pursue PhD research in. But one of the things that I stumbled across in my research as I was researching for the book, so the book I write is called The Justice of Jesus. Pre-order is alive now, comes out this September, but you can pre-order your copy wherever you pre-order copies today. Had to slide a plug for the book in there.
Every time, you got to do it. You have my blessing.
But as I was researching for this book, because I try to tell the story of my St. Thomas Indian Christian ancestors, and that as I talk about justice, and I talk about lessons that the modern Western evangelical church can learn from pre-Columbian, colonial Christian traditions, I look at this thing that I came across, this doctrine that's actually called the Law of St. Thomas. The Law of St. Thomas. Now, you could look this up. I don't know how much you'd find. You'd probably have to look at some primary sources from St. Thomas Indian Christians. And I write about this a good bit in the book, where basically what you really had when the colonizers came was a clash of two different ways of looking at truth. Where the Western colonizers came and told my St. Thomas Christian ancestors, who held to the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, that their Christianity wasn't authoritative truth, that the Catholic Church was authoritative truth. But St. Thomas Indian Christians had a completely different way of looking at truth, called the Law of St. Thomas. And if you look into the Law of St. Thomas, it's basically anyone and everyone can be saved through whichever means of divine grace is available to them, because Christ is everywhere. And so St. Thomas Indian Christians actually did not feel this pressure for 1,500 years before the colonizers showed up. They did not feel this pressure to convert their Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain neighbors. They didn't feel the pressure because they had the law of St. Thomas that they believed was passed on to them by the Apostle Thomas, which is actually not too different from what a lot of the early church fathers believed when it comes to the doctrine of salvation and Christian universalism. Historical facts makes us uncomfortable in the Western church, but it was actually quite in line with that. But then the Catholic Church changed a lot of that theology over time as it fell in love with control, as we talked about in the last episode we did together. And they then exported that version of Christianity to India, where it was actually a very pluralistic society where Christians were so pluralistic that they were actually universalists, Christian universalists, according to the law of St. Thomas. And the way that the Portuguese Catholic Church reacted to this after discovering the law of St. Thomas was by burning all the ancient church documents that talked about the law of St. Thomas and that had liturgies. So
Really?
this was actually done at a synod called the Synod of Diemper in 1599. You can
I've
look
heard
this
of
up.
it. Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So Synod of Diemper was that synod where the Catholic Church was like, sorry, St. Thomas Indian Christians, you are going to subscribe to our norms, our way of worshiping Jesus. And that includes the law of St. Thomas. Can't have that. That contradicts with the teaching of the Catholic Church. But again, going back to a historical example of colonialism, where you see the colonizer's gospel, the colonial way of looking at Jesus and truth as, truth can only be found in one place, the way we determine it to be in the church, and truth anywhere else doesn't exist. Whereas you had even pre-colonial Christian traditions who saw things very differently, much in line with the early church, right? And so it's interesting to live in the tension of these historical facts.
There's way more we need to talk about. Like I already have ideas of where we need to go next.
Good thing we're doing this more
regularly.
in the future.
Yeah. That is good, because this is too much. Like I'm just to be able to hear like about the law of St. Thomas. Like you're not going to hear about that anywhere else. I had no clue about that. And these are the first things that jump out. Maybe we need to just talk about these next time.
Yeah.
But the fact that you had to say, you're talking about Christian universalism, you're rooting it in ancient sources, so not just making up some modern idea because the doctrine of hell makes us uncomfortable. It's funny you said this might make some Westerners uncomfortable, but universalism was one of the common options.
Yeah.
Or one of the streams, and we're like, oh, that makes us uncomfortable. Why would that make us uncomfortable? It's because my takeaway, and this will connect with the trauma in the church thing, is the reason that encountering some kind of universalism makes Western Christians uncomfortable is because we're scared that if we move in that direction, we're courting hell and damnation for ourselves and for our family and for others. So it's better. It doesn't really matter what early church theologians had to say. What matters is staying hyper vigilant, because if there's a chance that hell is this eternal conscious punishment that happens to anyone who just doesn't believe the right way, it's better to live your life in that fear than to suffer for eternity. So that is that vigilance is a traumatic response.
Right.
And that's why, like, what we need to explore, I'm actually working on because I've done some posts on hell lately, quite a few. So I've decided I'm going to do like a online seminar on just because a lot of people have wanted more on that. 2-minute videos aren't enough. So I've decided I'm going to do a longer seminar on the history of hell and connecting it with trauma in the church. I'll talk more about that and when people can sign up. But
Yeah. Sign me up, man. I'm lining up for that seminar. That sounds incredible.
So yeah, that's one of the things that we need to talk more about, I think. Some of this universalist stuff, that posture of the St. Thomas Christians to the culture that they were living in, which was, like you said, already a very hyper pluralistic kind of religious tradition, right?
Yes.
The religious traditions of India are so rich and varied, and it is just like a rainforest of different practices and posture or spiritualities, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know, there's something, you look at this was the other thing I wanted to say. You look at how much fear there is in the West about Christianity disappearing and going extinct. And you look at how little fear there is among the St. Thomas Christians about that,
Yeah.
when they're much smaller, a tiny minority in India, and they've been there for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
And the West, Christianity has been so dominant, it was shaped every single person's life. And it's crippled with this fear that it's all going to like be lost if we don't regain control.
It's like Gollum and the Ring of Power from the Lord of the Rings, right? The more you have it, the more you want to hold on to it. And
That's
you're
it.
afraid of letting it go. Everyone's a threat.
Yeah.
Can't have the precious.
Everyone's a threat. So I want to talk about that too.
Love that.
And just, I guess, as we wrap up, like, we didn't talk that much about colonialism, but we talked a lot about its effects.
Yeah.
And its effects.
Yeah.
This is becoming like a common sort of contemporary wisdom, emphasizing the importance of curiosity.
Right.
And I just think that there's so much life in that. If you're not curious about other people, if your default is they're a threat, they're a danger, you need to examine that, because that is a response of someone in kind of a dysregulated state.
Yes.
Curiosity is the opposite of colonialism.
Beautiful.
And that is how the second half of the earth should have been encountered, with curiosity.
Wow.
But it's like right away, the Western tradition switched into domination mode, because that's what it had learned you do with your enemies.
Wow.
You pacify them. Pacify is just a nice way of saying conquer.
Wow.
So
great place to close. Can't top that.
There's so much more here, and I am so glad. Thanks for being here with me, Joash. And yeah, we're gonna be talking together more regularly, which is really exciting. Yeah. So
which also means I'll be home a bit more in the future. So yeah, no, this has been great. I mean, I was in Dallas, Texas, and someone I ran into there was like, "Oh, I saw you on Freestyle Theology. I heard you on Freestyle Theology." And I was like, "This is amazing. This is an international podcast."
International.
Honored to be here.
That was so exciting to hear. So yeah, thank you for hanging out, and we'll talk again soon.
Sounds great. Until next time.